In this video, I will be teaching you how to make this, a beautiful house-cured pancetta, which is basically an unsmoked Italian version of bacon that is widely used in Italian cooking and also throughout the world because it's, well, just that awesome. Now, you're going to start with a piece of pork belly. Here I have a whole pork belly. If you're making a smaller amount, just use a smaller piece of pork belly. That's simple. Here I have some seasonings or some spices, so some whole black peppercorns, some whole star anise, as you can see here, some coriander seed. Whoops, careful there, clumsy. Also some mustard seed. Let's get rid of this lid here. And also some fennel seed. Now, you can really spice and season your pancetta however you like. This is just my personal preference. All you really need to make pancetta, though, is a curing salt mix, and here I'm using kosher salt with 0.2% sodium nitrite by weight. So I take the total weight of my kosher salt and I multiply that weight by 0.002, which gives me 0.2% sodium nitrite. And I'm laying a thick layer down on a sheet tray, and the sheet tray has parchment paper on it to help keep the salt from reacting with the metal of the sheet tray. Next, you're going to grind up your spices, and I add a little bit of salt to the bottom of a mortar, and I'm going to use a mortar and pestle here. I mean, this is the old school way of doing it. You just grind it all up, but it's kind of a pain and it takes a while. So I actually prefer to use this, a spice grinder, which is really just a coffee grinder, except for the fact that we've never ground coffee in, because once you have those essential oils from the coffee, it's hard to ever get that aroma out completely. So you're going to give it a few pulses until your spices turn to powder, and then turn that out into a container and sprinkle some on top of your bottom layer of salt and place the pork belly down on top of that. Notice how I have the pork belly fat cap up. You always want to go fat side up. And then I'm going to zest an orange and put that on top of the fat cap and rub it in. And then I'm going to go back with my spices, and I'm going to rub my spices into the fat cap. Now, we're using the same concept as to why you always want to make sure that you wrap your butter nice and tight when you store it in your fridge, because fat will absorb aroma. So your butter uncovered will taste like your refrigerator smells, right? But in this case, we're actually rubbing those spices into the fat cap, and the fat cap is going to absorb those aromas from our spice mixture. And then we're going to go back and we're going to cover generously with our curing salt mixture, the kosher salt and the sodium nitrite, kind of mound it up on the edges to make sure that the belly is completely covered. Going to place another piece of parchment paper on top, and then place another sheet tray on top. And I'm going to put some weights on this, like some heavy number 10 cans or some bricks, and place it in my walk-in for about 7 to 10 days. Now, after 7 to 10 days, it will look like this. You can see some of the moisture has been drawn out by the salt, and the curing process has begun. You're going to rinse the belly thoroughly under cold running water, and try to get off as much of that spice mixture as possible, and then place it on a rack to allow it to kind of drip dry, and go back with some paper towels. And you want to get this as dry as possible. Now, at this point, some people like to season with some white pepper or some fresh ground spices, but for me, this already has enough flavor, so I'm going to move on to the next step, which is squaring off the pork belly. And here I'm cutting off one end, and I'll trim the sides. This is just going to make it easier to roll, but you don't want to throw these pieces away. These pieces that you're trimming off can basically be used just like you would use any sort of salt pork. You can dice it up, throw it into your soups, your sauces. You can render down that fat, and it'll add a really nice, porky, meaty flavor to any sort of sauce or soup that you're making. And once you have the pork belly trimmed, it's time to roll it, and you're going to roll it up tightly in some cheesecloth. So here I'm cutting some long lengths of cheesecloth, and you want to make sure that the cheesecloth is a little bit longer than your pork belly. And I'm completely unraveling it. And once I have my cheesecloth laid down, it's time to now tightly roll my pork belly. And you really want to put some muscle and some strength into this. Notice how I'm leaning over and I'm really pressing down. As I press down that first edge, I'm pulling back with my fingertips. And you really want to take your time to roll this as tight as possible. And this does take some strength, and you just have to really kind of muscle it. And as you continue to roll the pork belly up, you want to, again, push your weight down into the belly as you're curling back with your fingertips to make sure you have a nice tight roll, because this will affect the curing process and also the aesthetics of your finished pancetta. Now, once you have it nice and tightly rolled, you're going to fold over one end or one edge of the cheesecloth and go back and make sure that you have the pancetta nice and tight, and then roll it up in the cheesecloth all the way. Now, once I've rolled the pancetta in one layer of cheesecloth, I like to then go back and roll it in a second layer of cheesecloth. And this just gives me a buffer zone, helps to dry out the surface a little bit more. Some people prefer to actually just roll it and tie it without any cheesecloth around it. This is just a personal preference of mine, and you can play around with wrapping it in 1 layer of cheesecloth, wrapping it in 2 layers, not wrapping it in cheesecloth at all. It's all completely up to you. And once you have it wrapped in the cheesecloth, you're going to go back, kind of twist it so it tightens up and cinches, and you're going to tie off one end, which is a piece of strong butcher's twine. And then it's time to truss this, or just tie it down to hold the shape. And notice how when I make this knot, I'm going to tie this about 1 inch to 1.5 inch intervals. I'm placing my forearm down on the rolled pancetta, or the rolled pork belly, and I'm making it super tight as I tighten that knot. And what I'm doing here too is I'm tying a cinching knot where I basically take this string and I loop it through twice, just like tying your shoes, but you're going to loop it through twice. And when you pull down and cinch it, it's actually going to stay in place and hold that knot nice and tight. So then you can go back, loop it one more time, pull down, and it's going to give you a nice cinch that's not going to unravel or loosen on you. It's going to keep your pancetta rolled nice and tightly. Now, once you have all your trusses tied all the way down, you can then go back and tie off the opposite end, and then take a pair of scissors and clean up those straggling strings. And if you know how to truss a piece of meat too, where you're using one long string, that will work here as well. It's all completely up to you what you want to do, but this is a little bit more approachable for someone who's just now getting into making pancetta. Now, you can label it, or you should label it with the date and hang it. So you want to hang this in your refrigerator or your walk-in for about 2 to 4 weeks, sometimes as long as 3 months. Now, you can hang it really in any room that doesn't get a lot of sunlight, with a temperature that never exceeds 70 degrees. About 60 degrees Fahrenheit and 60% humidity is perfect for hanging pancetta like this. And after the 3-week mark, this is how it looks. I'm going to now slice into it, and this has been hanging in my walk-in and curing for 3 weeks now. I'm going to slice into it, and you'll see that we have a nice rosy red interior, and that comes from the sodium nitrite that we use in our curing salt mix. That gives us that nice rosy interior. Now, the bigger portion I'm not going to use. I'm just going to loosely wrap that end in plastic wrap and rehang this in my refrigerator and go back to it as needed. And this will keep for months if you store it properly. I'm going to trim off the strings, trim off the other end, and basically just go back and unravel that cheesecloth that was wrapped around the pancetta. And now comes the best part of the pancetta making process, which is slicing and serving. So you can cut it into rounds just like this and eat it as is. You can also cube it up into what are called lardons. And those are used in soups, commonly very much used in some pasta dishes. Think spaghetti carbonara uses lardons of pancetta, even though it's more traditionally guanciale, but that's a whole other video post. Now here, just a simple serving method. Take your favorite greens. Here I have mosh, a little bit of cold pressed olive oil, a little Moscato vinegar, very lightly dressed because you want the pancetta to be the star of the show here. The pancetta has a very nice, complex flavor and aroma. And yes, I did cheat, guilty as charged. I sliced it nice and thin on my meat slicer because I have one. So if you have a meat slicer, it's definitely the best way to go for slicing this. Now you can also take your slices and roll them up into a little rose, a little flower like that, just kind of making a pancetta rose. Cute, huh? And you can use this to garnish plates or impress your friends, whatever. But really the most important part is the flavor. Drizzle with a little bit of cold-pressed olive oil right on top. Take your trusty, crusty baguette, cut some nice thick slices, layer them on your board here to go with your pancetta. And now it's time to eat. Simply take a piece of pancetta, put it on your nice baguette, little piece of your dressed mosh, and enjoy. Just pick it up and eat it just as is. No need to cook, no need to smoke. Has this beautiful, wonderful aroma and complex flavor that came from our spices and from the curing process. And if you're curious in how to make your own baguette to go with your homemade pancetta, I'll put a link to that video in the show notes as well. For more information and related techniques, you can check out this episode's show notes at stellaculinary.com/HCC6.